Hello and welcome to Patterned, the astrology podcast where we discuss real life astrology. My name is Julia Topaz, and I'm the astrologer and founder of Look Up the Stars Astrology and the author of Astrolographs. So today I want this episode to be about the Saturn return. This is a very popular topic in the astrology community, and I feel the need to defend my friend Saturn because I feel he gets a lot of bad rap. So first, let's define what is the Saturn return, because I have read some interesting things about this, and not everyone agrees with when does the Saturn return begins and when does it end. Sometimes I have clients who come panicked and say, "Oh my God, I am going through my Saturn return." And I look at it and I say, "No, actually, it doesn't begin for another 2 years." I don't know who began this thing, but some people believe that the Saturn return begins when Saturn enters the zodiac sign that it was in when you were born. So let's say your Saturn is in Aries. You think just because Saturn has just entered Aries, it means that it's your Saturn return. No, your Saturn return begins when Saturn returns to the position where it was when you were born, let's say 5 degrees before, 5 degrees after. For example, if your Saturn in your birth chart is located at 10 degrees of Aries, your Saturn return would begin when Saturn reaches 5 degrees of Aries. Then your Saturn return would end when Saturn is 5 degrees after the position where it was when you were born. Do bear in mind that the most dramatic and tangible effects of your Saturn return will happen when Saturn is more so 2 to 3 degrees away from your Saturn when you were born. The Saturn return is an event that everyone goes through several times in their life. And the first Saturn return happens when you are about 27, 28, or 29. That depends on the years. Saturn does retrograde quite a bit, and depending on the cycles of the retrogrades, that differs person to person, year to year. A Saturn return is described in the community as a moment that is really terrible and difficult. And I want to clear out some things. First of all, sometimes I get some pushback when I say, hey, the Saturn return is not a bad thing. There's always this one person who says, well, a lot of bad things happened to me when I had my Saturn return. Do bear in mind, hey, not because you are going through your Saturn return does it mean that everything is about the Saturn return. You might be having other transits. You might have Pluto square your sun, Pluto square your moon. First, let's go back on what does Saturn mean. Saturn in astrology represents the father figure, the authority figure, the boss figure. And so Saturn represents also our inner parent, our inner boss. Saturn represents things like maturity, responsibility, accountability, resilience, grit, perfectionism, high standards, excellence, prestige, reputation, stability, structure. All those things are pretty amazing, right? And we all, like, maybe not all, but a lot of us strive to have those things. Unfortunately, everything has its exact opposite. And so Saturn also represents much more difficult things: fear, judgment, criticism, fear of rejection, tendency to reject and isolate out of fear, insecurity, shame, crippling sky high standards that keep us cyclically dissatisfied. So if you have a strong Saturn in your birth chart, aka if Saturn forms strong aspects to planets in your birth chart, if you have what we call an angular Saturn, meaning Saturn is in your first house or in your 10th house, your seventh house, you know what those things mean. When someone has a strong Saturn, they usually will experience both spectrums of the Saturn energy. They will be more responsible, more accountable, more ambitious than the average person. And equally, they will also struggle more than the average person with self-judgment, self-criticism. They will struggle with a sense of shame, sense of not being enough, imposter syndrome. There is not a person who has imposter syndrome who isn't a strong Saturn type, a strong Capricorn type. So in general, for the purpose of the Saturn return, we are looking more so at the aspects of Saturn that represent maturity, accountability, responsibility. When we are going through our Saturn return, it's a checkpoint time. And so what is happening is it's a moment of either collecting rewards for work well done, or a time of receiving a bad grade or consequences for things that we haven't done. Think about it as like the final exam at the end of the year where all of your knowledge from the year is being tested. And if you've been an excellent student, then you collect all of your straight A's. And then if you didn't, now is the time where you collect punishment for not having worked during the year. And by the way, we also call it the Punisher. But truly, there is no emotion in astrology. Sometimes Saturn is described as a malefic, and then Jupiter is described as the benefic. And I genuinely don't believe in that. I've seen Jupiter creating very terrible consequences. There is no such thing as positive or negative. Things just are. And that's what Saturn is. Saturn is just, if you've done A, B, C, you will get D. And if you haven't done A, B, C, then you won't get D. And that's it. That's just the logic of it all. The Saturn return is the checkpoint. Now, in order to understand what your Saturn return means, or why did awesome things happen, or why did terrible things happen, or what even does it mean? First, we must understand the lessons and the stories that Saturn tells in your birth chart. So, for example, someone with a Saturn in the second house doesn't have the same lessons than someone with Saturn in the eighth house or the first house or the seventh house. And that brings me to my next point, which is that different people experience their Saturn return in different ways. And out of experience, if you are someone who already has a lot of Saturn energy in your birth chart, meaning, for example, Saturn is an aspect to your sun or to your moon or to your Venus, doesn't matter what the aspect is. Usually, those people don't struggle as much during their Saturn return. Why? Because these are usually people who are already quite responsible and disciplined and accountable and mature. And so usually there isn't too much accumulated debt by the time they arrive at their Saturn return. I'm saying usually because sometimes if it's, for example, a lot of Saturn square in the birth chart and the person hasn't lived up to their chart, they've chosen the low energy of Saturn, that could be quite difficult. But in general, for example, someone who's a heavy Neptunian or a heavy Uranian, meaning someone who has a lot of Pisces energy, someone who has a lot of Neptune energy in their birth chart, someone with a lot of Aquarius or Uranus aspects. Usually, those types tend to have accumulated more debt than the average person. In terms of energy, Uranus is more so about freedom, about experimenting, about novelty, and Neptune is more about escapism and sometimes avoidance. And when the Saturn return happens, usually those are the people who struggle the most with, okay, I actually need to get my life together. I need to make different decisions, or the decisions that I've made have not given me the outcomes that I might have hoped for. And that truly is Saturn energy. Saturn return is the time to settle your debt. Now, some people call it karmic debt. There's a lot of words about karma. I don't know what that means personally. I don't really like using those words because what does karma mean? I like when things are a bit more practical. And so I like to put Saturn more so as like all of the small choices that you made up until now and what is the result of that. For example, if you're someone who saved a lot of money religiously ever since you were a teenager, obviously those things compound. And when it's time for Saturn return, for example, especially if, let's say, your Saturn is in the second house or the eighth house, that would be the time where all of those small habits that you've had throughout the years would pay off. And that would usually manifest as like an investment that really pays off, buying a property, having an opportunity to inject capital in a company, things like that. Or if you've been really disciplined when it comes to your friendships or your romantic relationships, and you've abstained from indulging in situations that would be negative for you, now would be the time where, for example, you get to meet the right person or you consolidate your relationship with someone that you've been with, etc., etc., etc. Like this is truly the energy of Saturn and collecting your debt or being at a time where you have to course correct. It will always be somewhat dramatic in the sense that now is the time where the accumulation reaches a climax that either gives a positive culmination or the opposite. The accumulation of the choices that you made are now showing that it's time to course correct. So I think this is really something that I find reassuring, actually, because I don't like it when people talk about the Saturn return as this like terrible time and you're just suffering for 2 years. It doesn't really make sense to me. It's really about taking accountability for your choices and bearing the consequences. Now, in order to understand what your Saturn return is about exactly, you must do a few things. First, you must look at where is Saturn in your birth chart. So for example, for me, I have it in the second house, and my Saturn return was a lot about financial events. And if your Saturn is in your seventh house, obviously your Saturn return will be about relationship events. If your Saturn is in the 10th house, it will be about career and ambitions. So that's the first thing that you must understand, the house that it's in. And then if Saturn doesn't really form any significant aspects in your birth chart, that would be just the gist of it. If you are someone who has aspects of Saturn, and especially hard aspects, your Saturn return would be a time where those Saturn wounds would be reopened and exposed. And that would be a time where you are meant to work out those Saturn aspects in your birth chart. So for example, let's say you have Saturn square Venus in your birth chart. And so we're looking at lessons around self-worth and love and isolation, a feeling of not being good enough, not attractive enough, not worthy enough in general. Your Saturn return would be an opportunity to look at those patterns and heal them. Now, an opportunity to resolve birth chart patterns can very much so be a time where some events makes it glaring. It's like, oh, I've never realized that I was struggling with self-worth. So it's definitely, in my opinion, a positive thing anyways, because it's just about a checkpoint when it comes to what are the choices that I've made up until now. But it can definitely be difficult. Saturn return, it truly brings so many different energies. Some people get married, some people get divorced, some people get fired, some people start their own business, some people buy an apartment, some people sell an apartment, some people deal with family matters. Whatever the case is, usually the Saturn return brings some strong, tangible event, because once again, the very nature of it being the compound effect of decisions that we made or didn't make up until that point. Funnily enough, people often talk about the Jupiter return as something marvelous and an amazing opportunity that comes your way. And that is true. Don't get me wrong. Like I have seen the Jupiter return producing very nice events in people's life several times. But I've also seen the opposite. Jupiter and Saturn are almost the opposite in the sense that Jupiter tends to foam and expand anything it touches, but for better or for worse, right? If there was a parasite, Jupiter would multiply it endlessly because in general, Jupiter represents the concept of abundance and multiplication. We see it as something positive versus Saturn is all about accountability and the natural consequences of your actions. Saturn is literally cause and consequence. So there is a harshness to Saturn that isn't as fun as Jupiter. And Jupiter also has that lucky effect because Jupiter could multiply something even though you didn't really work hard for it. Versus with Saturn, those things don't happen. So I think that's why there is this shyness around the Saturn return, but that's not how I see it. And I am advocating for Saturn's rehabilitation. And the last thing I want to say once again is that, yes, sometimes you can have a terrible Saturn return, but you do want to get into the habit of looking at what other transits are you having at the same time. Because sometimes we get laser focused on one thing because we're like, I'm having my Saturn return and I'm having a terrible time. Therefore, Saturn is terrible. But I think something else might be responsible for this. But in general, I think it's a really good time to course correct. And do bear in mind that we get several Saturn return every 27 years. So if you're lucky enough, you'll have 2, 3 Saturn return, 4. I did write a Saturn return survival book that you can find on my website, lookupthestars.com, where I essentially detailed everything you need to know about your Saturn return. I explain how to interpret your Saturn return in your birth chart, and I gave you interpretations by sign, by house, by aspect. And then I also detail the likely events that might occur in your life during the Saturn return, along with prompts and exercises to fill out. So hopefully that was helpful and that clarified a little bit what Saturn return truly is about. If you liked this episode, please like, subscribe, and if you could rate it, it would mean the world to me. That was Patterned Real Life, Real Astrology by Julia Topaz, and see you in the next episode.